I came home, and my bed was gone. Not moved. Not cleaned. Replaced like I was already dead. The sheets I had folded that morning, gone. The pillows I had slept on for years, gone. Even the small crease in the mattress, where my body rested every night, erased. In its place stood something unfamiliar. A larger bed, brighter sheets, decorative pillows arranged like a showroom display. It didn't look lived in. It looked claimed. I stood at the doorway longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. Trying to convince myself I had entered the wrong room. But no, the window was still mine. The wardrobe still held my clothes. The faint scent of my perfume lingered in the air. Everything said this was my room. Except the bed. And in that moment, I understood something without anyone needing to say it out loud. Someone had decided I no longer belonged there. That bed wasn't just furniture. It was where I had rested after long, exhausting days. Where I had sat quietly during nights I couldn't sleep. Where memories had settled into the fabric over time. Every corner of that room carried a piece of me. The slight scratch on the bedside table. The faded curtain I kept meaning to replace. The exact way the sunlight entered each morning. It was my space, my comfort, my history. And now, it looked like a stranger had walked in and rewritten it without asking. The new bed didn't belong there. It didn't carry any weight, any memory, any meaning. It was just placed, like I had been removed from the equation entirely. Have you ever trusted someone with your home and regretted it? Have you ever given someone access, thinking they respected you, only to realize they were waiting for the moment to take more than you offered? What would you do if someone erased your life in 3 weeks? Not slowly, not subtly, but boldly, like your presence never mattered. Because that's exactly what happened to me. It didn't take long before I found out who was behind it. My daughter-in-law. She hadn't just stepped into my home. She had stepped into my room. The master bedroom. My bedroom. And the worst part, she didn't act like she had done anything wrong. I stood there, staring at that bed, letting the silence stretch just long enough. Because I knew one thing. Whatever I said next would change everything. And to this day, she still regrets it. If someone erased your place in your own home tomorrow, would you even see it coming? Subscribe now so you don't learn this too late. If you won't subscribe, explain why below. If this happened to you, would you stay silent? Subscribe now. But to understand how she got that bold, you need to know what I allowed. Long before anyone thought they had a right to change anything in that house, it was just me and Arthur. No noise. No opinions. No one trying to prove a point. Just us, and a quiet piece of land that didn't look like much to anyone else. I still remember the first day we stood there together. The ground was uneven, the grass was wild, and there was nothing but open space stretching in front of us. Arthur looked at me, smiled, and said, "This is it. Not this could work. Not we'll see how it goes." He said it with certainty. And for some reason, I believed him. We didn't have everything figured out. We didn't have excess money sitting around. But we had something stronger than that. We had a shared vision. Every wall that would stand later started as a conversation between us. Every corner of that house came from a decision we made together. It wasn't handed to us. It wasn't rushed. It was built, piece by piece, with intention. Building more than walls. Construction didn't feel like work. It felt like progress you could touch. I would visit the site almost every day, watching as the foundations slowly took shape. At first, it was just outlines on the ground, markings that only made sense if you knew what you were looking at. But Arthur always knew. He would walk through empty spaces and say, "This is where the bedroom will be. This is where the window should face the morning sun." And I would follow him, trying to see what he saw. Eventually, I did. When the walls started rising, something shifted inside me. It stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling real. The first time I walked through what would become our bedroom, I paused right in the middle of the space. There were no tiles yet, no ceiling, no doors, just raw structure. But even then, I could feel it. That quiet sense of belonging. When the house was finally ready, the bedroom became my favorite place without question. Not because it was the biggest room, not because it looked impressive, but because it held the most meaning. Arthur insisted the window be positioned in a way that allowed the sunlight to enter gently in the mornings. And he was right. Every day, the light would slip through the curtains in the softest way, filling the room without forcing itself in. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't overwhelming. It felt calm. We chose the bed together. Not the most expensive one in the store, but the one that felt right when we sat on it. I remember laughing because Arthur tested it like he was inspecting something serious, pressing down on the mattress, nodding like it was a major decision. But to him, it was. Because this wasn't just furniture. This was where we would rest after building everything else. Over time, that room became more than a place to sleep. It became a collection of moments. The wardrobe carried the scent of polished wood that never quite faded. Every time I opened it, that smell greeted me like something familiar, something steady. The curtains moved gently whenever the window was open, letting in air that carried the outside world in small doses. The walls, they weren't just painted surfaces. They had heard conversations. They had held silence. They had witnessed laughter, and the kind of quiet that only comes when two people understand each other without speaking. Even the bed. It carried the weight of years. Not physically, but emotionally. It was where we ended our days. Where we talked about plans, worries, small victories. Where life happened in its simplest form. When Arthur passed, the house didn't feel empty. That surprised me. I thought the silence would be too much. I thought every room would feel unfamiliar without him. But instead, it felt like he was still there. Not in a way you could see. Not in a way you could explain. But in the way everything remained exactly as we built it. The placement of furniture. The way the light entered the room. The scent that never fully disappeared. It was all still ours. That house became more than a place to live. It became proof. Proof that we had built something real. Proof that our time together wasn't just memories. It had shape, structure, and presence. This wasn't just a house. It was proof of a life well lived. Letting others in. Years passed, and eventually the house wasn't just mine anymore. Not in the same way. My son grew into his own life, and with that came new people, new dynamics, new energy. When he introduced me to the woman he would marry, I welcomed her. Not because I had to, but because I believed that's what you do when family grows. You make space. I gave her access to the house without hesitation. The kitchen shared. The living room shared. Even decisions about small changes. I listened. I adjusted. Because I thought respect would naturally follow. Because I believed that anyone stepping into a home built with that much care would understand its value. The shift I ignored. At first, the changes were small. Easy to overlook. A different arrangement in the living room. New items appearing without much discussion. Nothing that felt like a problem. Nothing that felt like a line had been crossed. So I stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of patience. I told myself it was normal. That adjustments happen when more people share a space. But looking back now, that was where it started. Not with something obvious. Not with a direct challenge. But with small steps that slowly tested how much I would allow. And I allowed more than I should have. Because to me, that house wasn't just walls and furniture. It wasn't something you could rearrange without thought. It wasn't something you could step into and take control of like it had no history. Every part of it meant something. Every detail carried weight. Every space told a story. And I thought that was obvious. I thought it didn't need to be explained. But I was wrong. And that's exactly why what happened next felt like a betrayal. Not just of me, but of everything I built. My son, Caleb, has never been a difficult child. Even as he grew older, he carried a softness about him that never quite left. He wasn't the kind to argue loudly or demand things. He avoided conflict whenever he could, often choosing silence over confrontation. Some people would call that weakness. I never did. To me, it meant he had a good heart. He listened more than he spoke. He cared more than he showed. But there was always one thing I noticed. Caleb struggled to stand his ground when it mattered most. He would bend to keep the peace. He would adjust to make others comfortable. And while that made him easy to love, it also made him easy to influence. I knew that. I just didn't think it would matter this much later. When Caleb introduced me to Sloane, I paid attention. Not just to what she said, but to how she carried herself. She was confident. Not the loud, attention-seeking kind, but the quiet, controlled kind. The kind that doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. Her words were always measured. Her smiles timed. She knew when to speak, when to pause, when to look directly at you in a way that made you feel like she had already figured you out. It wasn't something I could explain clearly at the time. But I felt it. That sense that she was always thinking 2 steps ahead. Still, she was polite to me, respectful on the surface. And Caleb looked happy. So I accepted her. Because as a mother, sometimes you choose peace, even when something doesn't fully sit right with you. It started with a conversation that didn't sound like a big deal. One evening, Caleb sat across from me at the dining table, his hands clasped together like he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. Sloane sat beside him, calm as ever. "We just need a little time," he said. That was how he began. Not with details. Not with urgency. Just a little time. I waited. He explained that they were figuring things out financially, that where they were staying wasn't ideal, that moving into the house temporarily would help them get back on their feet. Temporary. That word stood out immediately. "How long?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Not long enough for most people to notice, but long enough for me. "Just 6 months," he said. 6 months. It sounded reasonable. Short enough to feel manageable. Long enough to make a difference for them. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I understood what opening that door could mean. That house had always been steady. Predictable. Peaceful. Letting 2 more people in, especially a couple, would change the rhythm of everything. I looked at Sloane. She met my gaze without hesitation. No nervousness. No uncertainty. Just quiet confidence. Almost like she already knew what my answer would be. And that made me pause longer than I intended. Because Caleb needed me. But something about the situation didn't feel as simple as he made it sound. In the end, I said yes. Not because I ignored my instincts, but because I trusted my son. "We'll make it work," I told them. 6 months, Caleb repeated, almost too quickly. Sloane smiled. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, her expression controlled. There was gratitude there, but it didn't feel as emotional as I expected. It felt contained. Still, I didn't question it. We discussed small details, where they would stay, how we would share spaces, basic boundaries that felt obvious at the time. Nothing complicated. Nothing that suggested this decision would lead to anything more. At least, that's what I believed. The first few days were quiet. They settled in without much disruption. Their belongings stayed mostly in one area. Their presence was noticeable, but not overwhelming. It felt manageable. Normal, even. But slowly, things began to shift. Not in ways that could be easily pointed out. Just small adjustments. Sloane started spending more time in shared spaces, rearranging items slightly, adding her own touch here and there. Nothing drastic, but enough to make me notice. At first, I told myself it was harmless. After all, they lived there now too. It made sense that they would want to feel comfortable. It wasn't just the changes. It was how they happened. There were no conversations beforehand. No, is this okay? No effort to include me in decisions. Things would simply appear different. A chair moved. A decoration replaced. And when I asked, Sloane would respond calmly, almost casually. I thought it worked better this way. Not disrespectful. Not aggressive. But not exactly considerate either. Caleb, on the other hand, said very little. If anything, he agreed with her. Nodding. Backing her decisions without much thought. And I could see it happening. That quiet shift in influence. The way his voice became less present in those moments. The way her presence filled the space more than his. Weeks passed, and the small changes became more frequent. Sloane moved through the house with increasing ease, as though she had always belonged there. She opened cabinets without hesitation. Rearranged shelves. Even the kitchen, a space I had kept consistent for years, started to feel unfamiliar. Items were no longer where I left them. It wasn't enough to cause an argument, but it was enough to make me pause each time. And each pause came with the same thought. Should I say something? But I didn't, because every change on its own seemed too small to challenge. And I told myself, it's temporary. 6 months. Still, something inside me kept track. Not in anger. Not in frustration. But in awareness. Because I could feel the balance shifting. The house no longer moved entirely at my pace. Decisions were happening around me, not with me. And while nothing had crossed a major line yet, the direction was clear. But I stayed patient. Because I believed in the agreement. Because I trusted that 6 months meant exactly that. 6 months. Be honest. Would you let them move in? Comment yes or no. Because that 6 months quietly turned into something else. It started innocently enough. A vase moved from the dining table to the shelf. A blanket folded differently on the sofa. A small rug swapped for a new one. I noticed, of course. But it didn't feel like a problem yet. Sloane's choices were subtle. Almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. And most days I was. She had a way of doing things so quietly that by the time I realized it, the room looked different. Not dramatically so. Just shifted. Caleb didn't seem to see it either, or if he did, he never mentioned it. I told myself it was nothing. After all, sharing a house meant adjusting. Right. Sloane would casually remark on something I had chosen. The curtains are too heavy here. This corner feels crowded. Maybe this doesn't really work. Never rude. Never directly disrespectful. But persistent enough to plant doubt. I started noticing myself second-guessing. The things I once considered permanent, settled, or right suddenly felt questionable. I realized she wasn't just moving objects. She was shifting the perception of the house itself. And Caleb. He agreed with her. Even on things I had lived with for years. Even on decisions I didn't want changed. It was subtle. Almost invisible, but undeniable. And then the social media posts started. Sloane would take pictures in rooms that felt familiar to me, yet she made them look entirely different. Bright lighting, coordinated colors, a home that looked curated. Friends commented, Compliments came in. Likes accumulated. And with every post, the house seemed less mine in my own mind. Even though I was still living here. It's strange how validation from strangers can make someone feel like an intruder in their own space. The space I had spent decades shaping suddenly looked like a stage for someone else. The small things escalated further. I would enter a room, and something would be off. Books arranged differently. Photos moved or replaced. Even the smell of polish seemed different, less mine, more hers. Nothing overt. Nothing confrontational. But the pattern was clear. She was staking a claim without saying a word. And each time I confronted Caleb, he would shrug. "She's just making it nicer," he would say. Or, "I think it looks better this way." And I realized slowly, he wasn't protecting my space. He was letting it happen. Have you ever watched someone take over your space slowly, like you don't belong there anymore? Have you felt your decisions, your possessions, even your routines quietly sidelined, until one day you wonder if anything is truly yours? That's exactly what it felt like in my own home. A place that had been my sanctuary, my refuge, my life, was slowly being redrawn. I started withdrawing, not from Caleb, but from the rooms themselves. The living room felt tense. The kitchen, no longer inviting. The bedroom, unfamiliar. I caught myself hesitating before moving furniture I had arranged for years. Second-guessing whether a choice belonged to me or to her. Even small rituals, like sitting in my favorite chair with a cup of tea, felt disrupted. It was as if the house itself was bending toward her will, and I was no longer the one steering it. What hurt the most was Caleb. The boy I had raised, nurtured, and protected, now agreed with her more than with me. Every subtle change she made, he supported. Every opinion she voiced, he echoed. I began to realize that I had underestimated the quiet power of compliance. Not rebellion. Not confrontation. Just agreement. The effect was devastating. Together, they moved through the house with increasing ease. And with each day, the balance shifted further. I was still there, but less of me was felt. It's the slow things that hurt the most. Because when someone pushes boundaries aggressively, you see it coming. You can prepare. You can defend. But gradual change, gradual erosion is almost invisible. That's how Sloane did it. Every day, a slight rearrangement. Every day, a mild critique. Every day, Caleb agreeing. Nothing too big on its own. But together, they reshaped everything. Rooms no longer felt the same. Furniture no longer felt familiar. Even the air seemed adjusted. I questioned myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining it? It would have been easy to blame my own perception. But the evidence was everywhere. Objects moved. Corners redefined. The energy of the house subtly altered. I felt the pull to speak up, but also the pull to remain patient. Because 6 months, that's all they promised. And I kept telling myself, wait, give them the time. Have you ever felt powerless in a space you once controlled? Have you had someone reshape your environment, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until you question your own ownership? That's exactly the feeling I carried day after day. And yet, I did nothing drastic. The changes weren't just about objects anymore. It was about presence. Rooms became hers first. My access felt like a courtesy. Decisions I had once made seemed secondary now. Caleb, still compliant, remained caught in the middle. And me, I stayed silent, rationalizing that time would restore the balance. Because in my heart, I believed 6 months would end soon. But the real mistake, I gave her time and space. It started with a simple idea. Sloane suggested a cruise. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. At first, I thought it was harmless. "Why not?" she said with a smile. "It'll be fun. We can relax, get away from everything for a few days." Her voice sounded caring, genuine even. But something didn't sit right. I couldn't put my finger on it immediately. There was a tone beneath the words, a certainty, as if this trip wasn't just a suggestion, it was expected. Every few days, the conversation returned. "Have you thought about the cruise?" "I found a great itinerary. It'll be a chance for all of us to bond." Caleb seemed excited. Sloane's insistence wore down any resistance I might have had. And slowly, I began to tell myself that maybe I was overthinking. Maybe she was just enthusiastic. Still, I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach. A quiet warning I couldn't ignore. I've lived long enough to know the difference between genuine care and something that feels off. It was there, subtle, like a shadow brushing past the edge of my vision. I voiced it quietly to myself. Maybe I should wait. Maybe I shouldn't agree so quickly. But the repeated invitations wore down even my caution. And I told myself it's just a trip. It's harmless. Nothing will change. Sloane was careful. She framed every suggestion as concern for others. "Grandma, you need a break." "Caleb, you've been working too hard." Her words carried warmth, a tone that sounded nurturing. But it never matched the feeling inside me. I could sense a layer underneath. A nudge pushing me further than I would normally go. Yet I let it slide. Have you ever felt someone was guiding your choices, not with kindness, but with intent you couldn't see clearly? Have you ever ignored that small, nagging voice inside because the surface looked pleasant? That's what I did. Caleb, still ever the peacemaker, added his agreement. "It'll be nice, Mom. You deserve it." He didn't notice the subtle undercurrents. Or if he did, he chose to ignore them. And that made the decision easier to rationalize. Because when your child supports something, you convince yourself it's the right thing to do. After days of discussion, I agreed. Not fully convinced. Not without hesitation. But I agreed. It felt like the house, the relationships, and the long months of endurance had left me tired. I wanted a break. A moment of peace. I thought a few days away would reset everything. Little did I know, it was part of her plan. Some people plan betrayal quietly. Don't miss what happens next. I packed lightly. Took only what I needed. Left the house tidy. Locked the doors. I told myself I would return to the same calm, familiar place. I left believing the rhythm of the home would remain unchanged. I left thinking I would come back to peace. I had no idea that the moment I stepped out the door, everything I had built, protected, and cherished was about to be tested. The cruise began quietly. The waves lapped gently against the hull, carrying with them a rhythm that felt soothing. I leaned back in my chair on the deck, letting the sea breeze brush against my face. For the first time in months, the constant weight of the house felt distant. The sun reflected off the water in soft streaks, golden and steady. I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, a few days away could restore balance. As the ship glided across the horizon, I thought about the house I had built. About every wall Arthur and I had raised together. About every corner that carried a memory, small, silent, and deeply personal. It all felt intact, still mine, as if stepping away wouldn't change anything. I reflected on Caleb, on Sloane. And I convinced myself that the subtle shifts I had noticed before leaving would pause in my absence. I even smiled at the thought that when I returned, everything would settle back into place naturally. The cruise was beautiful. Meals shared. Laughter that came easily in the open air. Evenings where the horizon met the water in quiet simplicity. It was calm, almost too calm. I found myself letting down my guard entirely. Even telling myself that maybe Sloane's persistence, her insistence on this trip, had been nothing more than care. And as I looked at Caleb, Smiling, relaxed, seemingly at ease with everything, I allowed the thought to settle. This pause, this break is exactly what I needed. Yet, even in the calm, the small voice in my mind persisted. It whispered reminders. Remember what you noticed before. Trust your instincts. But I silenced it, rationalizing that a vacation was meant to quiet such thoughts. The days passed without incident, and the false security of the journey grew heavier. Everything felt right, and yet, something lingered on the edge of awareness, an echo of a home no longer fully under my control. Have you ever experienced a moment of perfect calm, only to realize that the real storm was waiting elsewhere? A time when everything felt like it was in order, but you knew, deep down, something was off. That's exactly how the cruise felt to me. I packed my belongings with a light heart. I smiled at Caleb, thinking of the days we had shared on deck. I reassured myself that this trip had restored peace, at least temporarily. I had no idea. I was coming back to a house that no longer recognized me. The first sign that something was wrong hit me before I even reached the front door. Trash bags. Several of them, stacked neatly along the curb. They weren't overflowing, they weren't careless. They were deliberate. As I walked closer, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that perhaps the crew had emptied bins before I returned. But my instincts didn't agree. There was a stillness around the house that I had never felt before. A quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was chaoujada. Foreign. Unwelcoming. I inserted the key into the lock, turning slowly. The familiar click echoed in a space that didn't feel familiar anymore. As I stepped inside, the air smelled different. Not bad, not necessarily unpleasant. Just not mine. Even the walls seemed slightly altered. The curtains slightly shifted. The furniture arranged in a way that made the house look lived in, but not by me. I paused. Everything was in place, but nothing belonged to me anymore. I walked into the living room first. The couch cushions were plumped differently. A vase that I had placed carefully on the mantelpiece was gone. The rug, not where I had positioned it. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt misaligned, as though it favored this new order over the old. I ran my hand across the arm of the sofa, a nervous gesture, instinctively checking that it was still my home. It was, but it didn't feel like it. In the kitchen, I noticed the subtle intrusions. Items I had stored meticulously were moved or replaced. Appliances shifted. Even the small tray where I kept morning teas had been replaced by a tray of Sloane's design. Every small detail screamed a silent message. This space belongs to her now. Caleb had barely acknowledged these changes, his silence almost as loud as the rearrangement itself. I realized then that the house had been transformed while I was away. Not violently, not overtly, but undeniably. The hallways offered their own proof. Photographs I had hung for decades were moved or hidden behind objects. The frames were still there, but the faces I loved, less visible. I stopped mid-step, letting the weight of the realization settle. Every corridor, every corner now carried her imprint. And I had been blind, trusting that a few days away would leave things unchanged. I forced myself forward. Each step toward the bedroom was deliberate, cautious. I braced for the moment I knew would hit hardest. The bedroom, my sanctuary, the space I had built, shaped, and preserved for decades. I knew that no small changes could have been made there without consequence. My heart raced, anticipation tight in my chest. I opened the door, and everything collapsed inward. The bed, my bed was gone. Not moved, not adjusted, replaced. Gone. The sheets, the pillows, the blanket, all replaced by her choice, her style. Everything I had once considered sacred in that room had been erased. I stepped inside, hand trembling, trying to make sense of the space. The walls were the same. The sunlight came through the same window. But the soul of the room, the essence of everything I had built, was missing. I sank into the edge of the mattress that remained, running my fingers along the sheets. This wasn't just a change in decor. It was a declaration. A silent, undeniable statement that my presence was no longer central. I closed my eyes. Every memory, every shared moment with Arthur, every quiet morning with Caleb seemed to evaporate. Even the familiar scent of polish that had once been comforting had been overpowered by something new, something foreign. I realized then how much the house had defined me, and how much had been quietly taken away. I had underestimated the subtlety of her plan, and I had underestimated how quickly space could feel alien when someone else occupies it as their own. Have you ever returned to a place you thought you knew, only to realize it no longer belongs to you? Have you ever felt your identity erased, not by force, but by careful, calculated replacement? That was what I faced. Every object, every arrangement, every detail was a reminder of what I had lost control over. And then I saw her, the one who had quietly transformed my home, the one who had taken what was mine and made it hers. And in that instant, I understood. The calm I had felt on the cruise was a trap. The peace I had imagined didn't exist. She was standing by the dresser, calm, unbothered, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just walked into a room that no longer carried any trace of me. Sloane didn't flinch when she saw me. No surprise, no hesitation, just a steady expression and a slight tilt of her head, like she had been expecting this moment. I stayed by the door for a second longer, letting the silence stretch between us. Because I needed to understand something. Was she going to explain or pretend? I see you've made changes, I said. My voice was even, controlled. Not raised. Not trembling. Just clear. Sloane glanced around the room briefly, as if assessing her own work. Then she looked back at me. I improved it, she replied. No apology. No pause. Just a statement. Simple, direct. Final. She moved slightly, resting her hand against the edge of the dresser. This room wasn't being used properly, she continued. Everything felt outdated, heavy, it needed a fresh look. Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive either. It was something else. Certain. Like she wasn't explaining herself. She was informing me. I let her finish, because I wanted to hear how far she would go. And your things, I asked. That question mattered more than anything else. Because replacing furniture is one thing. But removing someone's belongings, that's a decision. A deliberate one. Sloane didn't hesitate. I pack them, she said. Carefully, they're stored. Stored. Not returned. Not preserved in place. Just stored away. Like items that no longer belonged in the space they once defined. I stepped further into the room, my eyes moving slowly across every change she had made. Then I looked directly at her. And that's when she said it. Calmly. Without emotion. It's mine now. For a moment, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, but because I needed to understand the weight of what she had just claimed. Mine. Not shared. Not temporary. Mine. The word echoed in the space between us, settling into the walls, the furniture, the air itself. She wasn't asking. She wasn't negotiating. She had decided. I noticed Caleb standing just outside the door. Watching. Silent. His expression was unreadable, but his presence said enough. He had seen everything. He knew what had been done. And yet, he said nothing. No correction. No hesitation. Just quiet acceptance. And that cut deeper than anything Sloane had said. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Not outwardly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't react the way most people would expect. But internally, everything changed. The shock faded. The confusion settled. And in its place came clarity. Cold, steady clarity. Because this was no longer about misunderstanding. This was intentional. Every step she had taken, every change she had made, every decision Caleb had allowed. It all led to this moment. I straightened slightly, letting my posture reflect what I now understood. "You believe this is yours?" I asked. Not emotionally. Not angrily. Just directly. Sloane met my gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said. No softness. No doubt. Just certainty. That was all I needed. Because in that single word, she revealed everything. This wasn't about helping. This wasn't about temporary arrangements. This wasn't about improving anything. This was about control. And I had given her exactly what she needed. Time. Access. Silence. I had allowed it. And now she believed it was permanent. I looked around the room one more time. At the bed that no longer carried my history. At the furniture that didn't belong to my life. At the space that had been rewritten without my permission. And instead of reacting, I felt something settle inside me. Not defeat. Not even anger in the way people expect. Something sharper. More focused. A decision forming quietly, firmly, without hesitation. Because in that moment, I stopped seeing what I had lost and started seeing what I needed to do next. That's when something in me changed. After she said it, "It's mine now." The room went quiet. Not the kind of silence filled with confusion. Not the kind that waits for an argument. This was different. Still, heavy in a way that made every word that followed matter. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't react the way she expected. Because this wasn't a moment for emotion. This was a moment for control. I stepped further into the room, not hesitating this time. Each movement deliberate. Measured. The kind of movement that doesn't ask for space, but takes it. Sloane watched me closely now. Not with concern. Not yet. But with attention. Because something had changed, even if she didn't fully understand it. And Caleb, still by the door, shifted slightly, as if sensing it too. I turned to face her fully. No raised voice. No sharp tone. Just clarity. "You can start looking for a new home today." I said it once. No repetition. No explanation attached to it. Just a statement. Simple, final. For a brief moment, Sloane didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear me, but because she wasn't expecting that. Her expression shifted slightly, just enough to notice. A flicker. Caleb spoke first. "Mom." That one word carried hesitation. Uncertainty. But no authority. He didn't step forward. He didn't challenge me. He just stood there, caught between two positions he didn't know how to balance. I didn't look at Caleb. Not yet. Because this wasn't a discussion. And I wasn't opening the door for negotiation. Sloane regained her composure quickly. "You're serious?" she asked. Still calm. Still controlled. But now, there was something else beneath it. A question she didn't think she would need to ask. "Yes," I replied. No added emotion. No explanation. Just confirmation. "You can't just decide that," she said. There it was. Not loud. Not aggressive. But firm enough to test me. To see if I would retreat. To see if this was just a reaction. Or something more solid. I let her finish. Because I wanted her to hear her own words. To understand exactly what she was challenging. When I spoke again, my voice didn't change. "You've made a mistake," I said. Not an insult. Not an attack. Just a statement. Sloane's eyes narrowed slightly. What mistake? She still believed she was in control of the situation. Still believed this could be managed, adjusted, redirected. That belief was about to end. I finally turned to Caleb. He avoided my eyes for a moment. That told me everything I needed to know. He understood what was happening. He just didn't want to confront it. Did you agree with this? I asked him. A simple question, but one that carried weight. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, he answered, not with words, but with silence. I nodded once, not in approval, not in disappointment, just acknowledgement. Then I looked back at Sloane. This isn't your space, I said, each word placed carefully. You were allowed here. Not given. Allowed. There's a difference. For the first time, Sloane didn't respond immediately. Because now, the situation wasn't moving in her direction anymore. She had stepped forward too far, assumed too much, and now she was being pulled back. Firmly. Without hesitation. Without doubt. This is where most people fold. Would you? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't explain beyond what was necessary. Because authority doesn't need volume. It needs certainty. And in that moment, I had it completely. Sloane studied me, trying to find weakness. Trying to determine if this was temporary. If I would soften. If I would step back. But I didn't. She thought I was bluffing. Until I showed her who actually owned the house. I didn't move immediately after saying it. There was no need to. The room already carried enough weight. Sloane was still watching me, trying to measure how serious I was, trying to decide whether this was something she could push past or something she needed to rethink. Caleb stood in the same spot, uncertain, waiting for direction that never came. And me. I stayed calm. Because this part didn't require emotion. It required precision. I turned and walked out of the bedroom. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just steady steps down the hallway. I knew they were following me. I didn't need to look back to confirm it. People always follow when they realize they may have misjudged a situation. Especially when control starts slipping. I stopped at the cabinet near the living room, the one I had opened countless times over the years. The one that held things far more important than furniture or decoration. I opened it carefully. Inside were folders. Neatly arranged. Untouched. Exactly where I had always kept them. Because unlike everything else in the house, this was something no one had thought to move. No one had thought to question. I pulled out a single file and closed the cabinet. Turned. And faced them again. Sloane's confidence hadn't disappeared. But it had shifted. Slightly. Enough to notice. What is that? She asked. Still composed. Still controlled. But no longer certain. Caleb looked between us, his expression tightening. Because now, something real was about to be placed in front of them. I held the file in my hand, not opening it yet. You've been very comfortable making decisions in this house, I said. Not accusing. Not emotional. Just stating what had already happened. Sloane didn't interrupt. She waited. Because now she needed information. You rearranged rooms. I continued. You removed my belongings. A slight pause. You claimed ownership. Her jaw tightened just enough to register. But she said nothing. Because she knew every word was accurate. That's when I opened the file. Slowly. Carefully. And looked directly at her. You were never tenants, just temporary guests. The words landed harder than anything I had said before. Because this time, It wasn't opinion. It wasn't emotion. It was fact. Sloane's expression changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would notice. But enough. Enough to show that something had shifted internally. Caleb stepped forward slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. I turned one page in the file and held it just enough for them to see. "This house is under a trust," I said. Calm, clear. Everything tied to it is documented. Ownership, control, access. I let that settle for a moment. You were allowed to stay here under my permission. Nothing more. No lease. No agreement transferring rights. No claim beyond what I gave. And what I gave could be taken back. That doesn't change the fact that we live here, Sloane said. Her voice was steady again, but now there was tension underneath. She was trying to regain ground. Trying to hold onto something. But the difference now was that she was responding. Not leading. "It changes everything," I replied. No emphasis. No raised tone. Just truth. "You don't have a claim here." I closed the file gently. "You had time." A brief pause. "You had space." Another pause. "You confused that with ownership." This time, Caleb didn't stay silent. He looked at the file. Then at me. And I saw it. The realization. Not loud. Not dramatic. But clear. He understood now. This wasn't an argument they could win. This wasn't something they could talk their way out of. This had structure behind it. Authority. Finality. Sloane's posture changed slightly. Not defeat, but calculation. She was reassessing. Trying to figure out if there was another angle. Another approach. But this wasn't a situation built on perception anymore. It was grounded in something she couldn't adjust. Most people don't know their rights until it's too late. Subscribe now, because ignorance costs more than pride. If you won't subscribe, explain why below. I placed the file back under my arm. Not as a threat. Not as a display. Just as confirmation. "This ends now," I said. No anger. No hesitation. Just a boundary, clearly defined. Because once truth is made clear, there's only one thing left to face. The consequences. The room didn't stay quiet for long. Tension had been building steadily, and now it had nowhere left to go. Sloane was the first to move. Not physically at first, but emotionally. I could see it in her expression. That controlled composure she had held onto for so long was starting to crack. "This is ridiculous," she said. Her voice was still measured, but it carried sharp edges now. "You let us stay here. You made it seem like this was a shared space." There it was. An attempt to rewrite the narrative. To shift responsibility. To make it sound like everything that happened was somehow mutual. I didn't interrupt. Because I wanted her to finish. "You don't get to just walk in after leaving and start making demands," she continued. Now her voice had risen. Not shouting yet, but close. "We've been living here. We've been taking care of this place." Taking care. I almost responded to that. But I held back. Because reacting too early would weaken the moment. And I wasn't here to argue. "Enough," Caleb said suddenly. His voice cut through the room in a way it hadn't before. It surprised even me. Because this was the first time he had stepped forward, not as someone avoiding conflict, but as someone facing it. He looked at Sloane first, then at me. And for a moment, I saw something shift in him. Clarity. "This isn't right," he said quietly. Not loud. Not forceful. But honest. Sloane turned to him immediately. "What do you mean?" Her tone changed again. Now questioning. Now searching for alignment. But Caleb didn't look at her. He looked at me. "You didn't tell me everything," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization, directed at Sloane, but understood by both of us. The silence that followed carried weight. Because now, the balance had shifted again. "We didn't do anything wrong," Sloane said quickly. Too quickly. "We made improvements. We made the house better." Better? That word again. As if value could be measured by appearance alone. As if history, memory, ownership could be replaced by preference. "No," I said. Just that. One word. Clear. Final. The room stilled again. Because this time, there was no space left for interpretation. "You took what wasn't yours," I continued. Still calm. Still controlled. "And you assumed I wouldn't respond." Caleb ran a hand over his face, stepping back slightly. I could see it weighing on him now. The choices. The silence. The agreement he had given without thinking through the consequences. He looked between us again. "I didn't think it would go this far," he admitted. That was the truth. Simple. Unfiltered. And too late. "So what now?" Sloane snapped. There it was. The control she had held onto for so long, gone. "What do you expect us to do? Just leave?" Her voice rose fully now. Not measured anymore. Not contained. Raw. Frustrated. Exposed. "Yes," I said. No hesitation. No softening. No reconsideration. "That's exactly what I expect." The words landed clean. No room for misinterpretation. No space for negotiation. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Not in anger. Not in resistance. But in acceptance. Because he understood something now that he hadn't allowed himself to see before. This wasn't about preference. This wasn't about comfort. This was about respect. And that line had been crossed. He opened his eyes again and looked at Sloane. "We need to go," he said quietly. For a moment, she said nothing. Just stared at him. As if waiting for him to change his mind. As if expecting him to step back into the role he had played before. But he didn't. And that realization hit harder than anything I had said. Because now, she wasn't just losing control of the house. She was losing control of him. The energy in the room shifted once more. Not into peace, but into clarity. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be understood was now clear. There was no confusion left. Only consequence. I looked at both of them. Not with anger. Not with hesitation. But with finality. And then, I made the call. I didn't step outside. I didn't raise my voice. I simply made the call. Clear, direct. No hesitation in my tone. I gave the address. Confirmed the timing. And when I ended it, there was no going back. Sloane watched me closely, trying to read what I had just set in motion. Caleb didn't ask. Because deep down, he already knew. The house fell into a strange quiet again. Not the same silence as before. This one carried expectation. Every second stretched longer than it should have. Sloane moved slightly, packing once across the room before stopping again. "You're serious," she said under her breath. Not a question this time. A realization. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. The sound came first. A vehicle pulling up outside. Then another. Doors closing. Footsteps approaching. Firm, professional. Unemotional. The kind of presence that doesn't argue. It acts. Sloane turned toward the window instinctively. Her composure slipped for the first time in a way she couldn't hide. When the door opened, everything changed. Not gradually. Completely. The movers stepped inside, calm and focused, waiting for direction. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pointed. Everything that belongs to them, I said, goes out. Clear. Final. And in that moment, ownership wasn't a conversation anymore. It was action. No, wait, Sloane said, stepping forward. This time, her voice wasn't controlled. It wasn't measured. It was urgent. You can't just do this like that. But the words didn't carry the same weight anymore. Because the decision had already moved beyond words. The movers didn't look at her. They looked at me. And I gave a single nod. Then it began. Drawers opened. Closets cleared. Boxes filled. The quiet precision of the movers turned the house into a place of motion. Items that had slowly spread through my home were now being gathered just as quickly. Clothes, shoes, decorations, all of it removed without hesitation. Sloane tried to intervene at first, pointing, speaking, stepping forward. But every attempt faded the same way. Ignored. Caleb stood still, not resisting, not arguing, just watching. There was something different about him now. The earlier uncertainty had settled into quiet acceptance. He didn't try to stop the process, didn't try to defend what had happened. Because now, he understood the full weight of it, and there was nothing left to say. Sloane's composure didn't hold. Not this time. This is insane, she said, her voice rising again. You're overreacting. This doesn't make sense. But the words lacked direction now. They weren't shaping the situation anymore. They were reacting to it. She looked at Caleb, expecting support. But he didn't move. Didn't speak. And that silence hit harder than anything else. Because now, she was standing alone. One of the movers carried the last of her belongings from the bedroom. The room that she had claimed. The space she had reshaped. Now emptying piece by piece. Sloane stood there, watching it happen. Not in control. Not directing. Just witnessing everything she had placed being removed without pause. That was the moment. Not loud. Not dramatic. But undeniable. The shift was complete. With every item carried out, the house began to change again. Not instantly, but noticeably. Space returned. Order returned. The weight that had been pressing against the walls lifted gradually. I walked slowly through the rooms, observing. Not interfering. Just confirming. Everything was being restored. Boxes lined the entrance. Bags stacked outside. Everything that had entered under the label of temporary was now leaving the same way. Sloane stood near the door, silent now. Her earlier certainty gone. Caleb moved toward the exit, pausing briefly as if considering something. Then he looked back at me. Not with anger. Not with resentment. But with understanding. And without another word. They stepped out. The door closed. And just like that, the house started breathing again. The silence that followed felt different. Not heavy. Not tense. Just still. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel like it was adjusting around someone else's presence. It felt steady again. I stood in the living room, taking in the space slowly. The furniture was no longer competing for attention. The air no longer felt divided. Everything had settled. Not perfectly, but honestly, I didn't rush to change anything immediately. There was no need to. Restoration isn't about speed. It's about intention. I walked back into the bedroom, the room that had been altered the most, now empty of everything that didn't belong. I opened the wardrobe and brought out my things. The sheets I had folded myself. The items that carried familiarity. One by one, I placed them back where they belonged, not to erase what had happened, but to reclaim what was always mine. As I worked, something subtle shifted. The room didn't just look different. It felt different. The sunlight through the curtains landed the way it used to. The quiet carried meaning again. Even the faint scent that lingered in the air felt closer to what I remembered. Not because everything was exactly the same, but because the space had been returned to its rightful rhythm. I sat on the edge of the bed once everything was in place, and I allowed myself to think about everything that had happened. Not with anger, not with regret, but with clarity. Because moments like that teach you something you don't forget. Not about others, but about yourself. I realized something important. Giving someone access doesn't mean giving them control. Being patient doesn't mean accepting everything. And silence doesn't always protect peace. Sometimes it allows things to go too far. I had given time. I had given space. But I had waited too long to draw the line. And that was the real lesson. A home is more than walls and furniture. It carries identity, history, meaning, and respect for that space should never need to be demanded. It should be understood. The moment someone treats it like something they can take over, that's the moment boundaries must be made clear. There was no celebration, no dramatic ending, just a quiet sense of resolution, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. Because it's felt deeply. I didn't win anything. I simply restored what was already mine. And that was enough. Because at the end of everything, there's one truth that stands above it all. A home is a privilege, not a right. If you've ever been disrespected like this, share this story. Someone needs this warning before it's too late. I stood by the window one last time, letting the light settle across the room. The same way it always had. The same way it always should. And for the first time since all of this began, everything felt exactly where it belonged.